They said no one can survive waiting for 3 days on a frozen bridge, but the dog never moved. The wind over Blackridge Pass in Montana didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like something ancient breathing through steel and ice. At 4:17 a.m., the temperature had dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, and the world had turned into a sheet of silence broken only by distant creaking metal and the low hum of shifting snow. Standing at the center of the abandoned bridge was a white German shepherd named Ghost, his fur no longer white but hardened with frost, his body locked in place like a statue carved out of endurance. He had not sat down. He had not turned away. For 72 hours, he had not left that exact spot, staring down through the gaps in the bridge deck into the darkness below, as if listening to something no human could hear. Somewhere far beyond the curve of the mountain road, a military convoy was moving through rerouted terrain after a partial highway collapse, their headlights cutting through the fog in slow, disciplined rhythm. Inside the lead vehicle, Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell scanned the road ahead, his voice low over the radio, calm but alert, as the convoy approached the old bridge marked structurally limited access. No one expected to stop. No one expected anything at all. Then the first driver saw him, a white silhouette standing dead center in the lane. Mitchell raised a hand. The convoy slowed, tires crunching over thin ice as the lead Humvee rolled to a careful halt. Through the windshield, Ghost didn't flinch. He simply watched them, amber eyes steady, unblinking, as if measuring their intention more than their presence. "That dog's been out here a while," Corporal Jason Ford muttered, leaning forward slightly. "No tracks leaving, only circling prints. Same pattern." Mitchell studied the animal longer. Something about it didn't feel like chance. It felt deliberate, like the bridge itself had chosen this moment to reveal a secret. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic echo from below the structure, almost indistinguishable from the groan of ice. Ghost finally moved, but not away from them. He stepped forward one pace, then another, stopping exactly at the midpoint of the convoy's line of sight, turning his head slightly, as if asking a question without words. Mitchell exhaled slowly. "Hold position," he said into the radio. "We're not moving until we understand what that dog is guarding." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Below the bridge, buried beneath layers of shadow and fractured light, something faint stirred, not visible, not confirmed, but present enough to change the air itself. Ghost's ears tilted downward, his stance tightening, every muscle in his body shifting into alert stillness, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment to finally not be alone. The convoy engine noise softened as more vehicles powered down, one by one, until only the wind remained, threading through steel beams like a warning. Mitchell stepped out of the Humvee, boots pressing into snow that cracked under his weight. He looked at Ghost again, then toward the gap in the bridge railing. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "What are you trying to tell us?" Ghost did not answer in words. He simply turned his gaze downward once more, into the unseen dark beneath the bridge, where time had stopped waiting and something human still held on. The convoy did not move for a long time. Engines idled softly, then one by one shut off as if the entire line of military vehicles had agreed to listen to something older than orders. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell stepped closer to the edge of the bridge, his boots pressing into frozen gravel as he studied the structure beneath them. The wind pushed through the steel beams with a hollow tone, carrying that same faint metallic echo that had first made him pause. Corporal Jason Ford adjusted his gloves, scanning the underside of the bridge with a flashlight beam that cut through drifting mist. Ghost remained still, but no longer rigid. His posture had changed, not relaxed, but focused, as if the decision had already been made and now only execution remained. Mitchell lowered his voice and spoke into the radio, instructing the convoy to hold position and maintain perimeter security. No one questioned him. Something about the dog's presence had shifted the entire atmosphere, like an unspoken signal that this was no longer a routine passage. Ghost took the first step toward the side of the bridge where a narrow maintenance path descended along the concrete support. He did not look back to check if they were following. He already knew they would. Mitchell exchanged a glance with Ford and then nodded once. Both men moved carefully after the dog, their boots crunching softly against frost-covered steps carved into the bridge foundation. As they descended, The temperature dropped noticeably, and the light from above began to fracture into thin, broken shafts between steel girders. The world underneath the bridge felt suspended, removed from time, as if sound itself had difficulty surviving there. Ghost moved with precise familiarity, stopping only once to glance back and ensure they were close enough to follow. Below, the ground was uneven, a mix of rock, ice, and scattered debris carried down by seasonal floods. Mitchell raised his flashlight and swept it across the space, expecting nothing but emptiness. Instead, he caught a shape that did not belong to the landscape. At first it looked like discarded equipment, maybe part of a survival pack torn open by weather. Then the shape shifted slightly. Jason Ford froze. "Sir, there is movement," he said quietly, his voice controlled but alert. Mitchell stepped forward, careful with each step, and angled the flashlight lower. The beam revealed a partially collapsed emergency shelter structure wedged against the bridge foundation, camouflaged by debris and snow accumulation. Inside, barely visible, was a figure curled against the cold, covered partially by an emergency thermal blanket that had slipped out of place. Ghost stopped at the edge of the structure and lowered his head, emitting a low sound that was not a bark, not a whimper, but something between recognition and relief. Mitchell crouched immediately, speaking calmly as he identified himself, his voice steady and human, cutting through the cold silence. The figure inside shifted slightly, reacting to the light and sound. It was a man, dressed in military fatigues, his face pale from exposure, his movements slow but conscious. Jason Ford quickly moved to assist, checking vital signs with trained urgency while maintaining a careful tone. The man's name, once confirmed through a faded identification tag, was Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter. He had been part of a reconnaissance unit that had gone missing after a structural collapse reported 2 days prior. Mitchell exhaled slowly, processing the reality of the situation. Daniel Carter was alive, though clearly weakened by exposure and time spent isolated beneath the bridge. Ghost stepped closer, then paused, as if waiting for permission. Daniel lifted his head slightly, his eyes struggling to focus at first, then slowly sharpening as recognition settled in. His lips parted, forming a name that barely escaped above a whisper. "Ghost." The moment the word was spoken, something in the dog's stance softened, as if an invisible weight had finally been acknowledged. Mitchell signaled for immediate extraction support through the radio, his voice steady but urgent, requesting medical evacuation assistance to the bridge location. Above them, the convoy remained still, unaware yet that their mission had changed in meaning. Ghost moved carefully closer to Daniel, lowering himself beside him without hesitation, his presence no longer that of a sentinel, but of something gentler, something that had been waiting through hours that felt like days, not for discovery, but for return. Daniel's hand, slow and trembling, reached toward the dog's fur, making contact with difficulty but certainty, as if confirming that reality had finally aligned with memory. Mitchell looked away for a brief moment, not out of distraction, but respect for what he was witnessing. The wind above continued to move through the bridge, but beneath it, the cold no longer felt absolute. Something had shifted, not in the environment, but in the space between survival and hope. The evacuation signal came through the radio only minutes after confirmation, sharp and controlled, instructing all units to maintain position while medical support was dispatched toward the bridge coordinates. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell remained kneeling beside the collapsed shelter structure, his hand resting briefly on the cold metal frame as he listened to the distant sound of rotor blades beginning to form in the sky. It was still far away, but growing closer with every passing second. Corporal Jason Ford scanned the perimeter again, then returned his attention to the injured Marine, carefully adjusting the thermal covering to preserve body heat. The air beneath the bridge felt different now, no longer empty or abandoned, but filled with the quiet urgency of survival that demanded precision rather than panic. Ghost remained at Daniel Carter's side without moving, his body lowered, his presence steady as if he had already accepted responsibility for keeping the man anchored to the moment. Daniel's breathing was uneven but stable, each inhale deliberate, each exhale slower than the one before, as if his body was relearning how to trust the air around him. Mitchell spoke softly, asking basic questions to maintain awareness, his tone calm and steady, grounding Daniel's attention. Daniel responded in fragments at first, then with more clarity, explaining in short phrases that the collapse had separated him from his unit during a rapid evacuation following a structural failure along the upper ridge route. His memory was fragmented but consistent, focused less on the event itself and more on the hours that followed, where sound faded and time became difficult to measure. He mentioned the dog only once at first, glancing toward Ghost as if unsure whether he was real or part of memory. Then he repeated the name more clearly, and Ghost responded by shifting closer, pressing his body gently against Daniel's arm in a quiet confirmation that needed no explanation. Above them, the sound of the approaching medical helicopter grew stronger, its presence cutting through the wind as it began its descent toward a clearing near the bridge approach. Mitchell activated the landing coordination channel, guiding the pilot with precise instructions while Ford secured the area to ensure a safe extraction path. The rotor wash had not yet reached them, but its anticipation moved through the air like pressure before a storm. Ghost did not react to the noise. His focus never left Daniel. As the helicopter came into view between the steel beams of the bridge, its lights sweeping across the snow-covered ground, the entire environment shifted again into controlled motion. The convoy above repositioned to allow clear access, their vehicles forming a secure corridor leading toward the extraction point. Mitchell gave the final instruction for transfer readiness, and Ford moved carefully to assist in preparing Daniel for transport. Through it all, Ghost remained exactly where he had been, as if his role was not to move with the operation but to ensure nothing about it was forgotten. Daniel's eyes followed the movement of the soldiers around him, then settled once more on the dog beside him. There was no urgency in his expression now, only recognition and something quieter, something that looked like relief without needing words. He raised his hand again, this time more steadily, and rested it against Ghost's fur. The contact was simple, but it carried the weight of time that had been endured in silence. Mitchell observed the moment briefly before turning back to the operation, his voice steady as he coordinated the final lift. The stretcher was secured with careful precision, and Daniel was prepared for extraction. As the helicopter stabilized above the landing zone, a final gust of wind moved through the bridge structure, carrying away the cold stillness that had defined the place for days. Ghost finally lifted his head, watching as Daniel was raised toward the light and noise above. For the first time since the convoy had arrived, he took a single step back, not in departure, but in acknowledgement that what he had been holding onto was no longer lost. The helicopter ascended slowly, carrying Daniel away from the shadow beneath the bridge, while the soldiers below remained momentarily still, witnessing the quiet end of an impossible wait that had required nothing but presence to complete. The sound of rotor blades faded into the distance as the helicopter carrying Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter disappeared beyond the ridge line, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the wind that filled it. Beneath the bridge, the remaining members of the convoy stood in a brief pause, not from protocol, but from something less formal and harder to define. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell remained near the extraction point, watching the empty space where the aircraft had been only moments before, his expression steady but reflective. Corporal Jason Ford adjusted his gloves again, then slowly exhaled as if releasing tension he had not realized he was holding. Ghost stood a few feet away, no longer focused on the ground below or the space Daniel had occupied, but instead on the direction the helicopter had gone, as if tracking something beyond sight rather than sound. Mitchell finally broke the silence, signaling the convoy to prepare for departure, but his voice carried less urgency now and more restraint, as though the mission had quietly shifted into something less operational and more human. Vehicles began to restart one by one, engines humming back to life in a controlled sequence that contrasted sharply with the stillness they were leaving behind. Ghost did not immediately follow the movement. He remained still for several seconds longer than necessary, then slowly turned away from the bridge support and stepped back onto the frozen ground where the convoy had first stopped. There was no hesitation in his movement, only a steady transition from waiting to leaving, as if the purpose that had held him in place had finally completed its course. Mitchell watched him closely as the dog walked along the side of the convoy line, passing each vehicle without fear or confusion until he reached the lead Humvee. Without instruction, Ghost approached the passenger side door and paused, looking briefly inside at Mitchell through the glass. The two held eye contact for a moment that needed no translation. Mitchell gave a slight nod, subtle and respectful, acknowledging something unspoken between them. Ghost then moved to the rear of the convoy, choosing a position that felt neither assigned nor random, but natural, as if he understood where he now belonged in the order of movement. As the convoy began to roll forward, tires compressing snow and gravel beneath them, the bridge slowly receded into the background, its steel structure fading into the gray outline of the mountain terrain. The air grew clearer as they descended the route, and the tension that had defined the earlier hours gave way to a quieter rhythm of motion. Inside the lead vehicle, Mitchell reviewed the incident report on his tablet, documenting coordinates, timeline, and recovery outcome. But his attention kept drifting back to the brief moments beneath the bridge. Ford broke the silence once, noting that the dog had not been tagged or assigned to any known unit, and that his behavior suggested long-term field conditioning beyond standard training parameters. Mitchell did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked out at the passing landscape, where snow-covered trees stood like silent witnesses to events that would never appear in official summaries. After a long pause, he finally spoke, saying that not all missions were defined by orders or objectives, and that some were completed without ever being assigned. The convoy continued along the mountain pass, moving steadily toward the nearest operational base, where formal reports would be finalized and medical follow-ups confirmed. Behind them, the bridge remained untouched, its structure blending back into the landscape as if nothing had changed, though everything beneath it had already been altered in ways that would not be recorded in any standard debrief. Ghost sat quietly in the rear vehicle, looking forward through the open gap between seats, no longer searching the distance behind them. The road ahead stretched long and quiet, carrying the weight of what had been endured and what had been returned, while the mountain wind slowly erased every trace of waiting from the place they had left behind. The convoy arrived at the forward operations base just after sunrise, when the mountain air was still sharp enough to carry the memory of night. Vehicles rolled through the secured gate in a steady sequence, tires crunching over compacted gravel as guards signaled clearance with brief hand gestures. Inside the lead Humvee, Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell finally powered down the engine and sat still for a moment before moving. The silence inside the vehicle felt different from the silence at the bridge, less heavy but more reflective, as if the world had shifted from urgency into understanding. Corporal Jason Ford stepped out first, scanning the perimeter out of habit before turning back toward the rear compartment. Ghost followed without hesitation, his movements calm and deliberate, no longer marked by tension or alertness, but by a steady presence that seemed anchored to something unseen yet resolved. Mitchell observed the dog as he dismounted, noting how Ghost no longer searched the horizon or listened for distant signals. Instead, he simply remained close, as if the act of arriving had become its own answer. Inside the medical facility adjacent to the base, Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter had already been transferred under observation. The sterile lighting of the recovery room contrasted sharply with the cold environment beneath the bridge, replacing frost and steel with soft illumination and controlled temperature. Daniel lay resting with a monitoring device attached to his wrist, his breathing now stable and measured, his condition no longer critical but still requiring careful attention. A military medic reviewed his chart and confirmed steady improvement, noting that early extraction had significantly reduced risk of complications. Outside the room, Mitchell and Ford stood quietly for a moment before entering, exchanging no words as they approached the doorway. Inside, Daniel slowly turned his head toward them as they entered, his expression tired but present. There was recognition in his eyes, not of rank or procedure, but of the men who had stood beneath the bridge when time had felt suspended. Mitchell spoke first, keeping his voice steady and measured, informing Daniel that the convoy had returned without incident and that recovery protocols were being followed according to standard procedure. Daniel listened without interruption, then slowly asked about the dog. The question was simple, but it carried weight that extended beyond explanation. At that moment, Ghost was brought into the recovery wing under supervision, moving calmly beside a base handler who had been briefed on. His presence, When the door opened and the dog entered the room, Daniel's expression changed in a way that no report could capture. There was no sudden movement or dramatic reaction, only a quiet shift, as if something inside him had aligned after being separated for too long. Ghost walked forward and stopped beside the bed, lowering his head slightly until he was close enough for contact. Daniel lifted his hand with slow effort, placing it gently against the dog's fur, and for several seconds neither of them moved. The room remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of medical equipment and the distant hum of base operations beyond the walls. Mitchell and Ford stood near the entrance, observing without interruption, understanding that what they were witnessing did not require commentary. After a long moment, Daniel exhaled slowly and closed his eyes briefly, not from exhaustion alone, but from relief that seemed to reach deeper than physical recovery. Ghost remained beside him without shifting, as if confirming that presence itself was enough. Outside the room, the morning continued its progression across the base, sunlight extending across concrete paths and metal structures, warming surfaces that had been cold only hours before. The convoy vehicles were being inspected and reset for future assignments, their role in the operation already absorbed into routine procedure. Yet for those who had been present beneath the bridge, something remained unchanged in memory, something that would not be listed in formal documentation or after-action reports. Mitchell eventually stepped away from the doorway and looked out across the base, where movement had returned to normal rhythm. Ford joined him a moment later, both men silent for a time before Mitchell finally spoke, not as a report, but as observation, noting that some operations did not conclude when vehicles returned or when logs were closed, but when people were no longer missing from where they were meant to be. Inside the recovery room, Ghost finally settled onto the floor beside the bed, his body resting but his attention still present, as if the waiting had not ended entirely, but had simply changed form. Daniel placed his hand lightly on the dog's shoulder and kept it there, steady and certain, while the world outside continued forward without knowing it had already been quietly altered by what had been found and what had been held long enough to return. Days passed at the forward operations base, though time inside the recovery wing felt less like a measurement and more like a slow return to balance. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter remained under observation for 48 hours before being cleared for limited movement, his condition steadily improving under the quiet discipline of medical care and rest. The room where he stayed was simple, clean, and softly lit, with a window that faced the outer training fields where soldiers moved in distant formation drills, their presence a constant reminder that life outside continued in structured rhythm. Inside that room, Ghost rarely left Daniel's side. The white German Shepherd had been formally logged into temporary base supervision, though no one treated him like equipment or assignment. He moved with calm familiarity now, as if the space itself had accepted him as part of its order. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell visited once in the morning and once in the evening, always brief, always respectful, never interrupting the quiet understanding that had formed between man and dog. Corporal Jason Ford maintained the external report documentation, noting only factual details about recovery, extraction timing, and environmental conditions at the bridge site. But even in his written tone, there was an absence of the detachment that normally accompanied such records. Daniel spent most of his time awake, though not speaking often. When he did, his voice carried less strain than before, as if something internal had been released during the journey back from the mountain. He asked simple questions about convoy operations, about the route change, and about how long Ghost had remained at the bridge before discovery. Each answer seemed to settle something deeper in his understanding, as though he was assembling a timeline not just of events, but of endurance. Ghost responded to Daniel's presence with consistent stillness, choosing proximity over movement, resting near the bed or beside the chair when Daniel was allowed short periods of sitting. There was no trained command for this behavior, no instruction given, only continuity of presence that required no explanation. On the third day, a quiet evaluation meeting was held in a briefing room adjacent to the medical wing. Mitchell, Ford, and the base medical officer reviewed the incident summary together. The tone was professional, but the content carried an unusual weight. Daniel's survival had been attributed to a combination of structural sheltering beneath the collapsed support zone and early detection by convoy intervention, But the report also included an observation regarding the dog's extended stationary presence prior to discovery. It was noted that without that presence, the location would not have been identified in time for recovery operations. No one elaborated further on that point, yet it remained unchallenged. After the meeting, Mitchell returned briefly to the recovery room. Daniel was sitting upright now, his movements slower but controlled, and Ghost was resting at his feet. Mitchell paused near the doorway before speaking, asking Daniel if he remembered everything clearly. Daniel took a moment before answering, then said that memory was not the difficult part, but understanding why the dog had stayed was something he could not fully explain. Mitchell nodded without pressing further, as if accepting that some answers were not meant to be translated into formal language. Outside, the base continued its operations without interruption. Convoy units were reassigned, training exercises resumed, and communication logs returned to standard cadence. Yet for those who had been present at the bridge, there was an unspoken awareness that something had occurred outside the usual boundaries of assignment and protocol. Not a deviation from procedure, but an expansion of meaning within it. On the fifth morning, Daniel was cleared for limited outdoor movement under supervision. He stepped outside into the cool air, accompanied by a base medic and Ghost walking beside him. The sunlight was soft, filtered through light cloud cover, and the ground beneath them carried the faint sound of boots and distant engines. Daniel paused near the edge of the training field and looked out across the open space, breathing deeply for the first time without awareness of restraint. Ghost stood beside him, facing the same direction, neither leading nor following, simply present. Mitchell observed from a distance, hands resting at his sides, his expression unreadable but steady. Ford stood nearby, silent as well, both men watching not an operation, but a continuation of something that had never fully ended. Daniel finally spoke, not to anyone specific, but into the open space ahead, saying that he had thought about the hours beneath the bridge more than anything else, and that what he remembered most clearly was not fear, but the certainty that he was not alone. Ghost turned his head slightly toward him, as if acknowledging the memory without needing to revisit it. The wind moved gently across the field, carrying no urgency, only presence. Mitchell eventually stepped forward and placed a small acknowledgement report into Daniel's file, marking full recovery status, pending final clearance. It was a procedural act, but it felt smaller than the moment it described. As the sun shifted higher, Daniel began walking slowly along the edge of the field, Ghost pacing beside him in steady rhythm. There was no destination, no objective, only movement after stillness, and the quiet understanding that some bonds were not created in moments of arrival, but in the decision to remain when departure would have been easier. Behind them, the base continued its disciplined order, but forward in the open air, something quieter had taken shape, something that did not require acknowledgement to exist, only continuation. On the seventh morning after the recovery operation, the base felt quieter in a different way, as if the urgency that had once defined every movement had slowly dissolved into routine awareness. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter had been officially cleared for light-duty observation walks, and for the first time since the bridge incident, he moved without medical assistance, his steps slow but steady as he exited the recovery wing into the open air. Ghost walked beside him immediately, matching pace without instruction, his presence natural and unforced, as though the boundary between recovery and field life had never truly existed for him. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell observed from a distance near the edge of the training field, standing with hands loosely folded, watching the two move along the gravel path that bordered the open drills area. Corporal Jason Ford joined him a moment later, holding a small tablet with updated operational notes, though neither of them focused on documentation at that moment. Daniel walked with a quiet awareness, his gaze occasionally shifting to the horizon where the mountains framed the base in soft layers of gray and green. There was no tension in his posture now, only a gradual return of presence, as if each step was rebuilding something that had been suspended in time. Ghost stayed close, never stepping ahead, never falling behind, maintaining a constant alignment that required no command structure. As they reached the midpoint of the field, Daniel paused and looked down at the ground for a moment before speaking in a calm voice, saying that he had been thinking about the bridge not as a place of survival, but as a place of waiting, where something had remained long enough for him to be found. Mitchell listened without interruption, his expression steady but reflective, while Ford glanced briefly toward Ghost before returning his attention to the horizon. The wind moved lightly across the field, carrying distant sounds of training drills and vehicle movement, blending operational life with the quieter rhythm of recovery. Daniel continued walking after a moment, his pace slightly more confident now, and Ghost adjusted immediately to match him, their movement synchronized without effort or hesitation. Mitchell eventually broke his silence, speaking in a low tone that did not interrupt their path, noting that in many operations, outcomes were measured in extraction times and survival probabilities, but there were rare instances where presence itself became the defining factor. Ford did not respond verbally, but his slight nod suggested agreement. As they reached the far edge of the field, Daniel stopped again and turned slightly toward Ghost, resting his hand briefly on the dog's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it carried a sense of closure that did not require further explanation. Ghost remained still under the touch, his gaze forward, as if acknowledging not only the moment, but everything that had led to it. Mitchell looked away briefly, scanning the base perimeter, then returned his attention to the pair, recognizing that nothing further needed to be said. The morning continued its steady progression, sunlight gradually strengthening across the training grounds, softening shadows, and warming the surfaces of equipment and structures that had stood unchanged through every event that had passed through them. Daniel resumed walking, now slightly ahead of where he had been before, while Ghost continued beside him without deviation. Behind them, Mitchell and Ford began to move back toward their assigned duties, their roles returning to standard flow, yet carrying an unspoken awareness of what had unfolded outside the boundaries of protocol. The base functioned as it always had, structured and precise, but within that structure remained something quieter that could not be logged or reported in full. As Daniel and Ghost disappeared further along the edge of the field, their figures becoming smaller against the expanse of open ground and distant mountains, the moments settled into stillness not as an ending, but as continuation. There was no final resolution, no dramatic conclusion. Only the steady reality that some connections did not conclude with recovery or return, but simply persisted beyond the moments that defined them, carried forward without instruction, without command, and without need for explanation. By the time the 8th day arrived, the forward operations base had fully returned to its standard operational rhythm, as if nothing unusual had ever disrupted its structure. Vehicles came and went through the main gate in scheduled intervals. Communication channels maintained their constant flow of updates, and training formations resumed across the outer fields under the steady discipline of routine command. Yet within that normality, there remained a quiet awareness among those who had been present at the bridge, an understanding that some events do not fade simply because procedures move forward. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter continued his gradual reintegration into active duty observation status, though his movements were now unassisted and increasingly confident. He walked the perimeter path each morning accompanied by Ghost, the white German shepherd who no longer carried the stillness of waiting, but instead moved with the quiet certainty of belonging. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell observed them from the edge of the administrative building courtyard during one of these walks, his posture unchanged, his attention steady but reflective. Corporal Jason Ford stood beside him, reviewing updated operational schedules, though his focus often drifted toward the field rather than the data on his screen. Daniel and Ghost moved together at a measured pace along the gravel path, passing training sections where soldiers practiced coordinated drills, their movements synchronized with practiced efficiency. Daniel's gaze occasionally followed them, not with distraction, but with recognition of continuity, as if observing the structure of discipline that had carried him through both chaos and recovery. Ghost remained consistently beside him, neither leading nor following, but existing in parallel alignment, responsive not to command but to presence. As they reached the far end of the field, Daniel paused briefly and looked toward the distant mountain ridge line that framed the horizon beyond the base perimeter. The air carried a light breeze, steady and cool, moving across the open ground and through the flags positioned along the training lanes. Daniel spoke quietly, saying that he had realized during the days of recovery that survival was not defined only by extraction or rescue, but by the fact that something had remained when nothing else could be certain. Mitchell, still observing from a distance, did not interrupt, allowing the words to exist without response. Ford lowered his tablet slightly, listening without comment. Ghost stood beside Daniel as he spoke, his posture unchanged, his attention forward, as if the statement required no acknowledgement because it was already understood in a way language could not improve. After a brief silence, Daniel resumed walking, and Ghost adjusted immediately to match his movement, maintaining the same quiet rhythm they had developed over days of shared presence. Behind them, the base continued its structured operations without deviation, yet the atmosphere within that space carried a subtle shift, something that could not be measured in reports or recorded in logs, but was recognized by those who had witnessed the bridge and what followed beneath it. Mitchell eventually turned away from the field, signaling the continuation of daily duties, while Ford followed a moment later, both men returning to their responsibilities without further discussion. Daniel and Ghost continued along the perimeter path until they gradually moved beyond the central field, their figures becoming smaller against the expansive layout of the base. The morning sun strengthened slightly, casting longer lines across the ground and softening the edges of shadows that had once felt sharper during earlier days. In that quiet transition from observation to distance, there was no final declaration or closing moment, only the steady continuation of movement, as if what had been found and what had been held was never meant to conclude, but simply to remain part of everything that followed. Several weeks had passed since the bridge operation, though at the forward operations base time no longer felt defined by a single event, but by what it had quietly changed in those who lived through it. The structure of daily life remained unchanged on the surface, with training rotations continuing across the fields, convoy schedules maintained with precision, and communication logs recorded with standard discipline. Yet among the personnel who had been present during the mountain extraction, there was a shared understanding that something had settled into memory in a way that would not be removed by routine or replaced by newer assignments. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter had been formally reassigned to light operational duty status, with medical clearance allowing full mobility and participation in non-deployment field coordination. He moved through the base now without assistance, his presence steady, his expression calm in a way that suggested recovery not only of physical strength, but of internal balance. Ghost remained with him under official integration approval into base K-9 support rotation, though in practice he was not treated as a unit asset in the conventional sense. He stayed close to Daniel by choice and consistency, accompanying him during morning perimeter walks and afternoon field observations, always maintaining a measured pace that aligned naturally with Daniel's movement rather than directing it. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell observed this continuity on occasion from administrative positions near the training grounds, his attention often pausing when their figures crossed the open field in quiet motion. Corporal Jason Ford had completed the final operational report for the bridge incident, which now sat archived under standard recovery classification, though both men understood that what had occurred could not be fully captured through procedural language alone. One morning, Daniel stood at the edge of the training field where the ground opened into wide visibility across the base perimeter. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and metal from distant equipment, and the sunlight stretched evenly across the terrain without interruption. Ghost stood beside him, still and attentive, facing the same direction without deviation. Daniel remained silent for a long moment before speaking, his voice steady and unhurried, saying that he had once believed survival was measured by the moment one is pulled back from danger, but now understood that it could also be measured by what continues to stand with a person after the danger has already passed. There was no response required from those nearby. Mitchell, who had arrived earlier and remained at a distance near the observation post, listened without interruption. Ford, standing slightly behind him, lowered his gaze briefly before returning his attention to the field. The words did not function as reflection on the operation itself, but as acknowledgement of what had formed in its aftermath. Ghost shifted slightly, not out of alertness, but as if responding to the change in Daniel's stance, maintaining contact through proximity rather than motion. Daniel then began walking along the perimeter path, and Ghost immediately matched his pace, their movement steady and unbroken. They passed training sections where new units were conducting drills under instructor supervision, the rhythm of commands and responses echoing across the field with practiced coordination. Daniel observed briefly but did not stop, continuing forward with Ghost aligned beside him. Mitchell eventually turned away from the observation point and returned to his duties, signaling the continuation of the day's operational structure. Ford followed moments later, both men resuming their responsibilities without discussion, as though the shared understanding required no further confirmation. In the days that followed, Daniel and Ghost were occasionally seen moving through different sections of the base, sometimes near administrative corridors, sometimes along outer training paths where fewer personnel passed. Their presence became familiar rather than notable, integrated into the environment in a way that no longer drew attention but remained recognized. Ghost no longer appeared as an anomaly or exception within the system, but as something that existed alongside it without conflict. Daniel's recovery was formally documented as complete, with no remaining restrictions on duty assignments, though he continued to remain at the base under standard rotation status. One late afternoon, as the sun lowered toward the ridge line beyond the perimeter fence, Daniel stood once more at the open field boundary. The light at that hour stretched long and soft across the ground, reducing contrast and blending structures into a unified tone of color and shadow. Ghost sat beside him without command, his gaze directed forward. Daniel looked across the base one final time that day, not as someone observing a facility, but as someone acknowledging the passage of something that could not be repeated in the same form. He placed a hand lightly on Ghost's shoulder, holding it there for several seconds without movement. The gesture was neither ceremonial nor final, but simply present. After a moment, he withdrew his hand and began walking again, and Ghost rose immediately to follow. Behind them, the base continued its steady rhythm of operations, unchanged in structure and function, yet carrying within it the memory of what had passed beneath the bridge and what had remained afterward. As they moved toward the far end of the field, their figures gradually blending into the broader expanse of the landscape. There was no conclusion marked, no final point of departure or arrival. Only continuation remained, steady and unbroken, carried forward without need for explanation, defined not by what had ended, but by what still walked beside it.